Hello, in this video I want to look at the responsiveness options available when using CS Grid that do not include meteor queries. So min-max function, implicit grid, and Autofit. So here we have our setup. We have a wrapper, a container, two items, then we have our margin and padding reset, our wrapper to give everything a little buffer. And then we have our container, which has we'll make this black actually, black border around it, display grid with a gap, and our starting setup is two columns, one fractional unit and two fractional units. So this is a 1:2 ratio. And as we adjust this window, we see that the columns keep their proportions. All right. Okay, the next thing I'd like to look at is the min-max function. And so to do that, I'm going to turn this off and then turn this one on. So we have grid template columns just like before, but instead of saying 1FR, I say min-max open parentheses, start with 100 pixels, comma 1/2FR close parentheses. So what this is saying is if it gets smaller, if this cell gets smaller than 100 pixels, keep it the same size, but let it grow up to 1FR. And so if I go over to Firefox, let me save and refresh here. Once this gets down to 100, it won't get any smaller. We can't actually see this because the number's too small. So let's make it 300. So now when it hits 300, it stops. And the A will stay the same size, and it will keep growing past 300 when there's room. But once it hits 300, it won't go any smaller. And we can see that in the B column is now shrinking. Okay, the next thing I'd like to look at is implicit grid. So if I turn on another item here, these two, A and B, are picking up the grid template row height of 100 pixels. And then those are the only two cells specified. But once there's a new cell, it's not picking up that grid template row anymore. This is an implicit grid. And by default, what it's going to do is collapse to the size of the content. But I could specify what happens for each new row created as new rows are populated. So to do that, I'll use the grid auto rows parameter. And then if I set this to 100 pixels, now this will pick up the 100 pixels. And then as I add more elements, they'll each be 100 pixels from now on. And I can even hide that one. The rows, though, can also be dynamic. So for example, if I turn both of these off for a second, the height will be determined by the content of the cell. So if I add more text here, right, and then in this other one, right, this will determine the height of the cells. I could also say, if I wanted to, I could go to each of my items and give them a minimum height of whatever I want, 100 pixels. And what's nice about this is that by specifying the min height, I get my 100 pixels, but if it needs to expand to accommodate the volume of all that text, it can do so. So it's important to remember, like as we're changing our aspect ratio here, this text is still taking up the same amount of volume. So if there's less width to play with, the height has to fill in the gap, which is why it tends to be better to specify min height instead of height to let the cell adapt to more content. Okay, the last thing I'd like to look at in this video is the auto function. So let's see here. We'll uncomment this out. I will take it back down to 3, 2, 3. I will get rid of the lorem. And we'll make a simple 3 column. So I'll say repeat. 3 columns, 1 FR. Okay. So what I could do is I could say instead of 1 FR, we could add a min-max, just like we did before. And we could say the minimum is 200 pixels and the maximum is 1 FR. And so what that'll do, move this over, it'll be equal columns that are allowed to grow, but then when they hit 2, they won't collapse anymore. And then you'll see the cell is pushing right out of the container, which is not what we want. So what we can do is instead of saying 3, we can let the number of columns be dynamic, and that uses the Autofit property. So let's do that. Okay. So as it gets, see, as soon as it hits 300, it creates another row. And then you can just keep going, which is just killer. And then, I'm sorry, 200 pixels. So let's do 300. Two column, all the way down to 1 column, all with 1 parameter, which is just fabulous.